a stolen Soviet helicopter, a 2,000-mile SEAL rescue in the dead of night, a National Guard unit holding the line in Somalia. These sound like scenes out of a Hollywood movie, and they all happened in Africa. You've probably never heard about them, and that's by design, because Africa is where the US military runs some of its most secretive, most extreme, and most dangerous missions on Earth. So why is the US fighting there? Who are they fighting? And how have these missions stayed hidden for so long? Let's find out. The entire continent of Africa, with the exception of Egypt, falls under the military jurisdiction of the US Africom Command Center, generally referred to as Africom. That covers 53 African countries, more than 800 ethnic groups, over 1,000 languages, vast natural resources, a landmass of 11.2 million square miles, roughly 3.5 times the size of the US, and nearly 19,000 miles of coastline. Headquartered at Kelly Barracks in Stuttgart-Moringen, Germany, Africom has approximately 2,000 assigned personnel, of which around 1,400 work at the HQ in Stuttgart, with the rest assigned to US Africa Command units at MacDill Air Force Base, Florida, and RAF Molesworth, UK, and at key African posts, including the African Union, the Economic Community of the West African States or ECOWAS, and the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping and Training Center in Ghana. So what exactly does Africom do? The truth is that for the most part, we simply don't know. Most of Africom's activities are highly classified, and we only learn about them as a result of the FOIA, or Freedom of Information Access, requests or classified documents, which are usually released only years after the missions in question actually occurred. Operation Flintlock is one of the more prominent unclassified activities. It's a regular multinational training program meant to foster collaboration and strengthen African nations' ability to battle violent extremist organizations. Flintlock 24, held in May 2024 in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, featured almost 30 countries and approximately 1,300 personnel. But most of the really interesting missions are hidden behind the US's secretive 127E authority, known as 127 ECHO in military parlance. Section 127E of Title 10 of the United States Code, titled Support of Special Operations to Combat Terrorism, allows for the Secretary of Defense to spend a maximum of $100 million per year to support foreign forces, irregular forces, groups, or individuals engaged in supporting or facilitating authorized ongoing military operations by United States Special Operations Forces engaged in counterterrorism activities. In other words, the US Special Forces have the authority to engage in combat against whoever they designate as terrorist groups, without having to disclose those operations publicly. And according to a 2018 investigation by The Intercept, at least 23 different operations were conducted by the US military under 127E authority between 2017 and 2020, costing at least $310 million. In 2019, a Yahoo News investigation revealed at least 36 codenamed operations running in Africa, with US Special Operations Forces seeing combat in at least 13 African countries between 2013 and 17. According to a Vice report, teams of US Special Forces were carrying out nearly 100 missions at any given time in those countries, namely Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Chad, Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Libya, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Somalia, South Sudan, and Tunisia. So who is the US fighting against in these territories? In a nutshell, the adversaries are primarily various Islamic jihadist militant groups. Most notable among them are Al-Shabaab in the Horn of Africa region, Boko Haram in Nigeria and West Africa, various branches and affiliates of ISIS across northern and eastern Africa, and the Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin coalition, JNIM for short, in the Sahel. These groups and others have been sowing death and destruction and destabilizing much of Africa for decades, and the problem is only getting worse. According to a January 2024 report by the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, fatalities linked to militant Islamist violence grew by 20% in the previous year, from 19,412 in 2022 to 23,322 in 2023. 6,559 different violent acts were recorded. However, both North African and Mozambican theaters saw dramatic reductions in the number of fatalities linked to militant Islamist violence, 98% and 71% respectively. These declines illustrate the progress that can be made against militant Islamist groups in Africa in the war on terror, and much of that progress can be chalked up to the impact of the US's secret 127 ECHO authorized special ops. But daring US military operations in Africa stretched back long before the war on terror was declared in 2001. Back in 1988, the US Army stole a state-of-the-art Soviet helicopter from the middle of the Sahara Desert from right under the Libyan strongman Muammar Gaddafi's nose. In just 70 hours, over 60 men with the US Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment pulled off one of the most brazen military heists in recent history. Dubbed Operation Mount Hope III, the top-secret clandestine mission went off without a hitch, despite sandstorms and the looming threat of Libyan forces, without a single shot fired. The Special Forces managed to steal one of the Soviet Union's most prized possessions, a MiL Mi-25 Hind D attack helicopter. The MiL Mi-25 Hind D was among the most advanced Soviet helicopters at the time, and information about it in the US was limited. Dubbed the Devil's Chariot by forces in Afghanistan, it has 6 suspension weapons units on its wingtips, is equipped with a 4-barreled Yak B 12.7 machine gun, and can accommodate up to 12 anti-tank missiles with a sophisticated high-explosive fragmentation warhead capable of penetrating thick armor. The 18,000-pound machine was fast and adept at both combat and troop transport, making it the ultimate chopper at the time, and also incredibly difficult to steal. So how did the US manage to take off with one, and who did they steal it from? Operation Mount Hope III took place directly following the end of the Chadian-Libyan War, which raged across Chad between 1978 and 1987, with Chadian groups backed by France fighting against rebel Frolinat forces supported by Libya. This so-called Toyota War ended in September 1987, after the Chadians outnumbered the Libyans and regained control of the Aouzou Strip, whose annexation by Gaddafi had sparked the conflict originally. The Libyans lost thousands of troops and $1.5 billion worth of tanks, weapons, and equipment that were destroyed or abandoned during their retreat. Approximately 20 aircraft were also left behind at the airbase at Wadi Doum, with one in particular catching the eye of the US military, the Mi-25 Hind. After negotiations with French and Chadian forces, the US military was granted permission to recover 2 Mi-25s, one of which was at Wadi Doum. The mission was assigned to the US Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, also known as the Night Stalkers. Their task posed several unique challenges. Not only did they have to fly to the remote area in the middle of the night, but they also had to sling-load the massive helicopter and fly off without losing it or tipping off nearby Libyan guards. On June 10th, over 60 personnel boarded a Lockheed C-5 Galaxy with 2 MH-47 choppers loaded in the cargo hold. Departing from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the team flew to N'Djamena International Airport in Chad. There, they disembarked the C-5, loading up the 2 helicopters before departing for their 550-mile trip to Wadi Doum at midnight. Keeping the mission a secret was the only way it would succeed. Libyan forces remained in the target area and could easily be tipped off. At Wadi Doum, a team was already on the ground preparing the helicopter for transport. Flying it was deemed too risky as it had a bullet hole in one of the engines, so the rotors were removed in preparation for transport. The MH-47s then arrived on the scene. Their additional fuel tanks were removed to ensure that they had the power to lift the Soviet chopper, which was slung-loaded underneath one of the American helicopters, before taking off towards safety with the second in tow. The additional fuel tanks and rotor blades were flown out separately on a Lockheed C-130 Hercules. The recovery mission went off without a hitch, but just as they were approaching N'Djamena International Airport, the team was engulfed by a sandstorm, which virtually clouded out any visibility. Both MH-47s flew slowly and within sight of one another to prevent a collision as they braved the dust onslaught. Remarkably, they safely landed with the precious cargo intact, with not a single bullet fired or a man left behind. After the storm had settled, the Soviet helicopter was shipped to Fort Rucker, Alabama, where it was restored and thoroughly evaluated to inform and train personnel on enemy capabilities. You can still see it today at the Southern Museum of Flight in Birmingham, Alabama, where it's been since 2012. But it's not just prized enemy choppers that US Special Ops have liberated by means of a bold and potentially suicidal mission. In October 2020, the US pulled off the longest-distance nighttime hostage rescue mission in US military history in remote northeastern Nigeria. On October 31, 2020, CV-22 tilt-rotor transports carried a team of Navy SEAL Team 6 operators 2,000 miles into northern Nigeria. There, the SEALs parachuted into the darkness to rescue an American named Philip Walton, who had been kidnapped 4 days earlier in neighboring Niger by a group of armed men. Walton was a civilian, the son of a missionary who had been working in Niger for 30 years. The long mission required aerial refueling from several MC-130J turboprop planes accompanying the CV-22s, and the MC-130Js in turn had to be refueled by KC-135s that accompanied the mission. An AC-130J gunship and a Navy P-8A patrol and reconnaissance also joined the mission. The operation was a huge success, with the SEALs rescuing the hostage, killing 6 out of 7 kidnappers in the process, and all the aircraft returning safely with no casualties. In January 2023, 5 airmen received awards for their role in the mission, where they persevered through 11 hours of non-stop flying, multiple aerial refuelings, diplomatic delays, an unknown threat environment, and, for one CV-22, a total loss of critical aircraft systems. The pilot, Senior Master Sergeant Christopher Reedy, managed to regain partial use of one radio, through which he told the other CV-22s that his own aircraft could not continue the mission. After landing at a remote operating base, Reedy transferred some equipment and a weapon to another CV-22, which then took off to continue the mission. Eventually, the rescue package arrived at a point above northern Nigeria, where the SEALs parachuted to the surface, then hiked about 3 miles until they came upon the captor's small encampment in a copse of scrubland bushes and trees, which had been located by the CIA beforehand. After the SEALs picked up the hostage, the remaining CV-22 pilots landed in unfamiliar terrain cluttered with trees, rocks, and other obstacles to pick them up. With SEALs and rescued captives safely on board, they eventually returned, having pulled off a complex mission with very little time to prepare, a major endorsement for the effectiveness of Air Force Special Operations. "There is not another military in the world that could have pulled that off," then Acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller said in 2020. "The problem is you guys make it look so freaking easy." Osprey CV-22s were also at the heart of another major retrieval operation that took place in South Sudan in 2013, dubbed Operation Oken Sonnet 1. However, this time, things didn't go anywhere near as smoothly. South Sudan, a country that had only been in existence for 2 years since gaining independence following a horrific 20-year liberation struggle to separate from Sudan, was falling apart again and was embroiled in a new civil war. The security situation in Juba, the capital, and across the country was out of control. South Sudanese civilians and international expatriates began to flee the capital, seeking safety in the UN compounds or outside the city. By week's end, more than 20,000 civilians had crowded into 2 tiny UN compounds in Juba. In mid-December, Africom sent a contingent of soldiers from its East Africa Response Force to reinforce the embassy and protect the remaining staff members. Over 450 US and dual nationality citizens, in addition to all non-essential staff, had been evacuated by the 3rd week of December. On December 18, 2013, 3 CV-22 Ospreys assigned to the 8th Special Operations Squadron, or SOS, 2 MC-130P combat shadows from the 9th SOS, accompanied by a rescue HC-130 and a conventional C-130H, took off from Camp Lemonnier to Djibouti for the almost 1,000-mile flight to evacuate US citizens from Juba. The Juba operation went smoothly, and with the Herc safely landing to Nairobi with 120 civilians on board, the AFSOC crews headed back to Djibouti. Back at Camp Lemonnier, the CV-22 and MC-130P crews began planning for a second, more risky evacuation, this time from Bor. The airport at Bor had not been surveyed, which ruled out any fixed-wing operations. Furthermore, because of the confusing situation in and around the city, the embassy couldn't say how many Americans would need to be evacuated, so the crews had to plan for multiple trips between Bor and the safe location at Entebbe, 500 miles away. However, the leadership and crews were assured that the evacuation had been cleared with the opposing forces, so they would be flying into a permissive environment. Since the evacuation would thus be more or less safe, a daytime pickup was authorized. However, the environment they arrived into was anything but permissive. On December 21st, 3 CV-22s, Rooster 73, 74, and 75, and 2 MC-130Ps, Agile 21 and 22, took off from Djibouti, heading to Bor. On board the CV-22s were US Navy SEALs to provide security on the ground during the evacuation, along with para-rescuemen, PJs for short, in case medical support was needed. As the formation headed south, the CV-22s topped off their fuel tanks with gas from the MC-130s. Approaching the Bor airstrip, the runway was clear. Rooster 73 and the 2 wingmen circled for the landing, but on final approach, with the engine nacelles in the vertical position for landing, the air erupted with small arms, rocket-propelled grenades, and anti-aircraft fire. Opposition soldiers had embedded themselves among the civilian refugees, knowing the Americans would not fire into the crowd. Bullets began tearing up the lead CV-22. Close behind, Rooster 74 and 75 also began taking hits from heavy weapons fire. On Rooster 73, enemy gunfire hit the flight control, electrical, hydraulic, and fuel systems. Rooster 74 and 75 also took hits to their fuel systems, but the self-sealing tanks worked more or less as designed. However, the holes in Rooster 74 were still big enough that it continued to leak fuel for the duration of the mission. At this point, evacuating civilians from the camp was no longer an option. The crew of Rooster 73 had their hands full keeping the damaged aircraft in the air. As the mission commander worked to sort things out, Lieutenant Colonel Newell discovered that 3 of the 4 SEALs aboard the Rooster 73 were wounded. All 3 were in serious condition by the time the aircraft landed, with the 4th discovering that he'd also been shot once he disembarked. The problem was the 3 USAF PJs were en route to 74, the second aircraft in the formation, and there was no chance of landing until the Ospreys reached Entebbe. Pilots of Rooster 73 and 74 coordinated the wound diagnosis, treatment actions, and blood types with the PJs and also with Newell on board Agile 21. The PJs determined that if the SEALs were to survive, they were going to need blood as soon as they landed. They came up with an ingenious solution, a flying blood bank. Once the PJs had the needed blood types, they drew blood from healthy crew members. That ensured that within minutes of the 3 Ospreys landing at Entebbe, the PJs were administering life-saving transfusions to the wounded SEALs. After a hair-raising and complex refueling mission, crew of the battered aircraft finally received some good news. Not only was there a C-17 at Entebbe, fully fueled and preparing to return to the US, but the US soldiers on the C-17 were all part of a field medical unit that had been training with the Ugandans. They were ready and waiting when the Ospreys landed at Entebbe. The wounded SEALs were transferred to the C-17, received the blood transfusions arranged while en route by the PJs, and were already being treated by the Army surgeons as the C-17 flew to the medical facilities in Nairobi. As a result, all 4 SEALs survived their wounds. The 3 Osprey crews, Rooster 73, 74, and 75, were awarded the Mackay Trophy for 2013, recognizing the most meritorious flight of the year by an Air Force pilot or crew. After the SEALs had departed for Nairobi, the CV-22 crewmen counted a total of 119 hits from different caliber weapons on the 3 aircraft. Each Osprey lost critical systems but still managed to carry its crews and passengers to safety, and all 3 damaged Ospreys have since been repaired and are now back in service. The Americans at Bor were evacuated the next day to Juba by UN and civilian helicopters and joined 300 US personnel evacuated to safety over the following days. That was a heroic, if narrow, escape, to be sure, but it's another great example of the US's ability to complete dangerous rescue missions in Africa, even when things go horribly wrong. But what about actual battlefield combat? Arguably the most remarkable story of the US Special Ops in Africa revealed to date is the defense of Baladogle Airfield by New Jersey National Guardsmen. It was the fall of 2019, and there was a near certainty that the American-run Baladogle Military Airfield in the middle of Somalia was about to be attacked by al-Shabaab forces. The cavalry troops defending it knew the strike would be big, and they were right. On September 30th, an ominous plume of smoke rose toward the sky just northwest of the airfield. An al-Shabaab vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, or VBIED, had detonated prematurely, tipping the unit off to the imminent attack. Within minutes, the New Jersey National Guard's Charlie Troop manned the airfield's towers and control points, with snipers perched and mortars zeroed and primed. A convoy materialized on the horizon, kicking up red dust over the low bushes that surrounded the airfield, an old Soviet facility from the 1970s. An up-armored truck carrying one of the largest known VBIEDs on the continent broke off from the group, headed straight for the airfield. Captain London Nagai, the commander of Charlie Troop, readied his troops for impact. Defense of the base at that particular time was critical. US and United Nations planes were coming in and out of the airfield, and more than 50 civilian construction workers were busy repairing a portion of the runway. Nagai's unit was well rehearsed. Not only had he drilled his troops for an attack, but they were expecting it. The key was not engaging the enemy until they were committed to utilizing a specific route, said Nagai later, adding that would ultimately be a fatal choice for them. The planes were diverted and the workers moved. Plus, a month before, unit engineers had dug a ditch around the airfield, such that any vehicle smaller than a tank would get stuck in the ditch before it reached the fence line. The truck slammed into the ditch, and the soldiers peppered the vehicle until the driver died from gunfire. The al-Shabaab militants then detonated the bomb on the truck remotely, and the energy wave from nearly 5,000 pounds of explosives ripped across the site. It punched a 20-foot crater into the edge of Charlie Troop's perimeter and ripped a hole the size of 2 football fields in the airfield's fence. Within minutes, a 12-man al-Shabaab hit team arrived in a truck, equipped with rocket-propelled grenades, machine guns, small arms, and ordnance. They made their way towards the newly formed fence hole. The disorganized group tried to fire their RPGs from the sparse landscape that surrounded the airfield, but they were quickly dispatched by direct and indirect danger-close mortar fire. A remotely piloted aircraft then vaporized what was left of the truck. Altogether, the whole attack lasted less than an hour, and no Americans died. According to Lieutenant Colonel Richard Karcher, who was on the base at the time, there is no question that if it hadn't been for Charlie Troop, al-Shabaab would have destroyed the aircraft and killed as many people as possible. These are but a few of the crazy situations US servicemen have to deal with in remote areas of Africa. We look forward to details of more operations being declassified to shed further light on these dangerous and daring operations. But what do you think? Were you involved with these or other US military operations in Africa? Do you think the US and its allies are winning the war on terror? Please let us know in the comments, and thank you, as always, for watching. Now go and check out how SEAL Team 6 obliterated Somali pirates, or click this other video instead.